Good evening, everyone. Ignore the background noise. I'm so sorry about that. Thank you so much for joining us for this incredibly exciting session tonight focused on medical humanities. I am honored to introduce our guest speaker for this evening, Dr. Kimberly Manning. Dr. Manning is a professor of medicine at Emory University. She joined faculty there after completing her combined residency in both internal medicine and pediatrics. She currently serves as the Transitional Year Residency Program Director and as the Associate Vice Chair of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the Department of Medicine. Her work as a national leader in diversity has been acknowledged through the Society of Hospital Medicine Excellence in Diversity Leadership Award and the AAMC Group on Diversity and Inclusion Exemplary Leadership Award. In addition to her critical role in enhancing diversity and inclusion, she is a passionate clinician educator and splits her time between preclinical medical students and medical residents. She has been a society small group advisor since 2007 and currently co-leads one of the 4 academic houses at the Emory Medical School. Dr. Manning has a strong passion for building and strengthening diverse clinical environments and cultivating safe learning climates. Her love for teaching was recognized nationally as she received numerous awards, including the ACGME Courage to Teach Award and the Evangeline Papageorge Distinguished Teaching Award. Dr. Manning is also well known for using reflective writing to enhance patient-doctor communication and is passionate about fostering humanistic behavior and professionalism in trainees of all levels. She embodies all of this by writing her blog, Reflections of a Grady Doctor, to share personal experiences and stories from her career. In addition to being a prolific writer in journals and on Twitter, she co-hosts a podcast called The Human Doctor. Dr. Manning, thank you so much for taking the time to be here today. I honestly could go on and on for hours about all your inspirational achievements, but I'm going to stop here because we are all so excited to hear about what you have to share with us today. The floor is yours.
Hey, thank y'all so much for having me. And can I just first start by just saying how excited I am about how the cardio nerds have evolved. I mean, I'm so proud of you all. Fun fact, I met Daniel Ambender back in the day. In 2018, had come over to Hopkins to coach presenters for a bite-sized teaching competition that they were participating in. And I spent the whole day, one after the other, coaching people on their talks. And that's when I met Dan. And, shortly after that, I started to hear from them about their idea to start this podcast, which has blown up into all sorts of things. So Dan, I'm so proud of you and all that has come from this. And I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge your hard work. It's really making a big difference. And the fact that there's so many people here that get to do this, it's just really exciting. So shout out to you for that. I can't share my screen. Can I get whatever I have to do to be able to do that? Because I have a screen share.
Okay, so if you try to share the screen, it will,
It says host disabled participant screen sharing. And I don't think I'm a co-host. So, and I have been tasked with talking to y'all about narrative stuff. So, I could absolutely just wax poetic and take your questions, but I do have some slides I could share too. I could do whichever one. So you tell me.
Right. Dr. Manning, I do think I just made you co-host, so you should be able to share your slides right now if you
Okay,
share your
sweet.
screen.
Sweet. All right. I'm trying to quiet down some of my pings. That's what my podcast co-host calls it when my computer starts making sounds while we're recording. All right. All right, cool. Can y'all see that? All right, cool. I may or may not have just written CardioNerds Academy on my slide, right? Like as we were starting. So don't think I'm as organized as, you think. So listen, this is intimate, y'all. And I'll pause at places where you can ask questions. You can, if you do have a question or something you want to bring up, just unmute yourself and say, hey, Dr. Manning, quick question, just like you would if we were just all hanging out together. Okay. So I don't want you all to feel like it's such that you can't do that. So this is actually a talk that I give as a part of a workshop for our M4 medical students at Emory, specifically about physician storytelling. I think it's applicable to anybody. And what I'll do is kind of walk you through some of the ways that I think when I'm getting ready to write narratives. And I'm sure all of you have some narratives inside of you. There is a Native American proverb that says, "Tell me the facts and I will learn. Tell me the truth and I will believe. But tell me a story and it will live in my heart forever." And I think if anything underscores why it's so important for us to tell stories, I honestly think it's this. Um, I also have drawn a lot of inspiration from things that have happened in history. Historically, a really important moment in American history was when a 14-year-old boy named Emmett Till was lynched in Mississippi in 1955. His mother, when she saw his body, made a decision to have an open casket for the world to come and see her son. And she told the story over and over. And what she said was, "Let the world see." That was her quote. And I will tell you that your stories, at least how I think of stories when I'm telling them, is I say, let the world see, because sometimes what the world doesn't see is what we get a chance to see. So, usually if it's just a few of us here, and again, I don't want to use up too much time, but when I'm getting ready to do storytelling or talk about storytelling, and I can actually have y'all just think about this for when you're working with your clinical teams, if you want to build a good learning climate. I often start with this: what's your name? How is it pronounced under the very best circumstances? Um, what are you doing next year, or why are you here, or what brings you here today? And then what's something that we should know about you? And again, that slide is typically for that particular workshop. So, Abraham Verghese, who many of you are probably familiar with, the author, coming out with a new book right now that I haven't read yet, but he said in his paper, "The Physician as Storyteller, we should be ministers of healing, storytellers, story, story makers and players in the greatest drama of all, the story of our patients' lives as well as our own." But I always like to kind of start with Toni Morrison, because Toni Morrison, the Nobel laureate, the amazing Black woman author, she said something about her book, The Bluest Eye, the Pulitzer Prize winning book that she wrote at the age of 39. She said she wrote that book because it was a book she wanted to read. And again, I'm providing you all this inspiration because I want you, as you think about whether or not you're going to tell a story, write an essay, even create a program or a podcast or something like what Amit and Dan have done, right? What is it that you are hungry for that you haven't seen? So this is what she said.
The very first book I wrote, called The Bluest, was when I was not really thinking about publishing or reviewers or other readers. It was a book I wanted to read, and I couldn't find it anywhere. So I began to write it, and it took forever because it had no real reason for being done except my own reading pleasure. It was like a long reading exercise that took 5 years. So when I would read it and I didn't like it a bit, I would change it. I think it's been very helpful for me to look at it as a reader because it gives you distance. Your ego is not all entangled in it. You're not just thrilled with it because you wrote it. And some writers really prefer to be authors. Those are people who write because that's what they do, or someone has asked them, or they have a contract. I really call myself a writer because I only write when I can't not do it, when I'm so compelled to do it. And part of it is what I presume will be, since I'm a very good reader and a very fastidious and careful reader, very picky about what I like, I would try to write the kind of book that I really wanted to read.
You know what? Exactly what she's saying. You can overlay that with everything you teach, every talk you prepare, every program that you get behind, every innovation, every curriculum. Honestly, that statement has been my primary inspiration for most things that I have initiated doing in medical education. It was the thing that I wanted as a student and that I hungered for but could not find. And so I want you all to be thinking about that too.
The very first book I wrote,
So, what you should expect is a better understanding of why reflection is so important to us in medicine. I'm going to share some different types and styles of narrative writing. And I'll tell you, it's kind of hard to find really concrete stuff on narrative. Um, so, I am going to just unpack some of the things I think about and be very, very clear about it to kind of give you places to start. I'll share with you some of the components of a good narrative and some pointers on how to take a personal reflection and move it to publication. And then ultimately, by the end of this, you should be able to write a good narrative or be able to tell a story. So I'll give you some background and examples, some writing and sharing. And if we have time, we'll let somebody even try to tell a live story if we have time, but we'll see. All right. So why even write? This is another favorite quote of mine. As you can see, I draw a lot of inspiration from other writers. James Baldwin said, one writes out of one thing only, one's own experience. Everything depends of how relentlessly one forces from this experience the last drop, sweet or bitter, it can possibly give. What that means to me, you all, is that, there is a lot of extraordinary nestled inside of the most ordinary moments. So, yeah, those who've read narratives that I've written over Twitter, may realize that like sometimes what I'm describing is something that elapsed over like 90 seconds. It might be an interaction that I had with somebody that lasted 2 minutes long, and seems so ordinary. Something as simple as, oh, let me run back and check on Mrs. Jones to make sure her medicines are at bedside. And then something happens in that little moment that is the kind of thing that I forced a drop from. So don't just wait for like something to fall out of the sky, for it to be a code where you reached in and did a cardiac massage with your left hand while putting a line in with the other one. It doesn't always have to be that. In fact, the things that draw people in the most are usually things that are very ordinary and relatable. Um, I think everybody should have teaching and writing mantras. So this is my writing mantra, which I wrote back in, I think, 2012, 14. I don't know when I wrote it, but write it down, get it out of your head and onto some paper or onto a keyboard and then into a computer or something or somewhere. Just out. Whatever it is, however it seems, good, bad, random, joyful, painful, process it, explore it, excavate it, deconstruct it, reconstruct it, get it, learn it, honor it, feel it, master it, hold it, release it, celebrate it, love it, forgive it, be it, live it, or do none of those things. But whatever you do, just write. So sometimes when I'm looking for that, like, oh, I have writer's block, I need a moment, like, I'll read that and I'll be like, whatever you do, just write. It doesn't matter. Just start writing. So, um, narrative medicine improves your humanistic skills. You know, regardless of what you want to do in the future, how well you read EKGs, how, you can, stop cardiac arrhythmias in a single bound, you still are going to have human beings who are scared and worried and hoping that you can kind of allay some concerns. And reflection is a really great way to help you with that. It helps you grow as a personal, as a professional, because a lot of the narratives that I think about and write about are often places where I feel short. And I do think that your narratives can really build humility by reinforcing some of your lessons. It can help you understand your patients and yourself better. It encourages this active reflection because, again, the more you reflect, the better you get it. And then it helps you with processing things. I firmly think the panacea to me being burnt out a lot of times is this habit of reflection, just this idea that, like, wow, I could just sit down and write a story about how it felt to me when I saw the security officer that I hadn't seen in 3 weeks. Like, oh, wow, I could write about that. But it can also lead to peer-reviewed publications. You can, the good news about getting a narrative published is most of the time, if you send it to the right place, it's a high-impact journal, and you're the first author. So guess what? It's peer-reviewed, and it appears on your CV, and it counts, trust me, as somebody who had a lot of narratives on her CV when I got promoted. If you are a busy person, which I know you all are, um, use your smartphone to draw inspiration. Sometimes when I'm just out and about in Atlanta or other places, I'll just take pictures of things and I'll even, use photo editors to, sharpen things or draw things out and I'll save it. just so that I can go back and look at it and think about what I want to write about later or what I wish to reflect upon. This is an image taken in my neighborhood here in Atlanta, Georgia. I live in a part of town called Druid Hills, which is about 2 blocks away from Emory University. Historically, if you heard about redlining, it was firmly in the green back then and is still to this day. This pathway, though, which I pass every time I go on a run, is the servants' pathways. So for many, many years, um, if you were the help, which was pretty much Black Americans and immigrants, you could not walk down the streets that I run down now. So these little connecting pathways run all between a lot of the blocks. Um, and so now that I know that, I don't look at this as a shortcut anymore. I can see people that look like me. I picture, what it must have been like, how tired somebody's feet were. And I see that different all the time. So images can really help you to find inspiration. But every time I look at this picture, I can think of a completely different story to tell. Well, it could be rooted in now, it could be rooted in before, it could be imaginary, it can be anything. So images help you to remember things in high def too. I like to take pictures of a lot of things. One, because I don't have to ask everybody permission for pictures because they're mine. But this is a picture that was taken with a medical student. I was at a conference. Interestingly, the conference was Abraham Verghese had come to Emory to speak at Grady. So I was in line to meet Abraham Verghese when this young man taps me on my shoulder and asked me if I remember him. I was like, "No, sir, I do not remember you. But hi, good to see you." He says, "Well, I met you 5 years ago when I was working as a patient sitter at Grady, and I was studying for the MCAT, and you stopped and you talked to me for like 20 minutes, and you encouraged me. And all the time I worked at Grady, which was 3 years, you were the only person who talked to me." And I was like, "Wow." He said, "I just matched. I got my first choice. I'm doing emergency medicine. I'm going to be a doctor." I was like, "Wow." But here's the thing, because I'm a habitual reflector, y'all. I had a picture of it because when I met him that day, I was like, "What you doing? What you studying?" He was like, "I'm studying for the MCAT." "What? Are really serious about your books? Dang." So we stood and talked and I said, "I'm gonna take your picture so that when you blow up and you the Surgeon General, I'm gonna be like, I knew him when he was a sitter at Grady." And I saved the picture. And when he told me who he was, I said, "I have a picture of you in some blue scrubs. I know where it is. I'm gonna find it." So I shared that with him. I stayed in touch with him. And he became the first Black chief resident at his residency program just a few years later. Full circle. Now, listen, I can tell you 500 stories about this interaction. I can tell you a story about what it means to stop and notice people. I can tell you a story about a young man making up his mind to use his time wisely. I can tell you about what it means to be the first. I could find 100 different stories to tell you. And that's the cool thing about how you can use photos to kind of help you bring back things. So for every one of these photos, I have a story that I can tell and I can find. And I don't even need to tell you the story, but I do know that these are in my own collection. And if I'm looking for a prompt, sometimes just seeing the image reminds me of something else. So there's different types of narrative. See, okay. One is the critical incident report. That's where you like focus on something really challenging that happened. Those often lead to longer pieces. So, you know, that experience that you had uniquely as you, that you're like, dang, you know what? I really need to unpack that. That was hard. Or I had an adverse event happen, or somebody said something to me that was not affirming and that was a threat to our inclusive environment. And that didn't feel good. Um, Something I screwed up, those are great critical incidents. There's also just reflective personal essays and poetry that tends to sort of explore some of the emotive parts of practice. But it's also been shown to impact your personal and professional growth. So good narrative writing, if you want to write a good narrative, it should show but not tell, meaning don't tell me how to feel. Don't tell me that, and now, this is sad because you know, oftentimes narrative like juxtaposed to like a whole bunch of like editorial doesn't always read well for a narrative. Now, if you write an editorial and you wish to start it with a narrative, that's fine. But if you're just trying to write a true narrative, Give me the story, lay it in front of me, and leave me to make my observations, but not conclusions. Every story you tell, you should ask yourself at the beginning, why am I telling this story? What's the what? What's the point? On our podcast, Ashley McMullen and I always ask each other before the person tells a story, what's the what? And we pick a word as the what because it is something that really like makes you think first, why am I about to tell this? Why is it important for anybody to hear this? So I think that's a really good thing for you all to remember too. Um, so how do I choose what to write? Usually I'll write about something if I'm like, dang, that's an aha moment. Wow. Um, or if I just notice something really extraordinary, um, anything that was memorable that happened to me, a unique perspective from my positions, because each one of us, as I looked at all your faces when I joined, it's a very diverse group of people. Every one of you has a different life lens, and the way that you interact with this world is going to be drawn through that life lens, and that is interesting. And there is something in it for other people. When I write from the perspective of a Black American woman who is a descendant of human beings who survived being enslaved. That is a unique part of my identity. It is different than if I'm a Black person who does not have those parts about me. So use your own life lens to tell your story from your unique perspective. You can share lessons in caring and humanism and relationships, but also something called appreciative inquiry, which is like just an appreciation for the experiences that you have. I know a lot of you wonder about HIPAA. So that's the elephant in the room. Ain't I witty, y'all? I see my elephant in the room, literally. All right. So here's the thing about HIPAA. There's 18 unique identifiers. I like to ask people permission, but here's the truth. Most stories that I tell, I just de-identify people and change a lot of details. But the thing that always stays the same is the lesson. That's why it's good to ask yourself, well, what's the what? Why am I telling this story? So if I know that the what is a particular thing and I know what I want you to get from this story and I know why I'm telling the story, it doesn't matter if I change this, nonagenarian, South Asian male into an octogenarian white woman. Like it doesn't matter because the lesson is the lesson. And there will sometimes be features of people that make the story truer. Now, in those instances, especially if I'm going to go to a journal, I will ask permission. I have never had a patient um like most of the time when I want to write about patients directly, they want me to use their name. I'm like, I'm not using your name in the annals of internal medicine. But they're like, please, I want my name in lights. Um, and I also tend to not write about things that are negative. So I think things where a patient is not held in the best light is places where you can get in trouble. One unique identifier that I can't avoid is Grady Hospital. Geographic location is an identifier. So I have to be pretty careful when I'm writing things because, I'm at Grady. Before I move to some specific types of things I use, and I'll mention this one a little bit more. I actually have found that writing is if I'm talking to the person. You came in and said this, you did that. I looked at you and you said this. I don't gender people a lot. I don't tell you what they look like. I'll describe how they talk, and you can decide if what you're hearing in your head is African American vernacular. And you can decide that like, oh, well, she's in Atlanta, Georgia at Grady Hospital. It's a safety net hospital. It is likely that this person that she is speaking to has racial concordance with her. But I didn't tell you for sure. And I actually find that to be a really cool show don't tell thing, right? So one style that I use is one called the loop, and that's where I start and end the story with the same statement, right? I wrote a piece once for the Annals of Internal Medicine about a woman who I had diagnosed with metastatic lung cancer, and I started it by saying, "I'm glad I lost my insurance. If it wasn't for Grady, I don't think I would have been here. I'm glad it was you." And then I told the whole story, and then that was the last thing she said, and that's how I kind of ended it. So looping, the same statement, like kind of bookending it is a really great. Thread is to me, not like a Twitter, but the thread is where you use a word or a phrase or a metaphor all through the narrative for emphasis. So, another example of this, was, a piece I wrote about a colleague who unfortunately, was nearing the end of life, uh, who was in my division, and, it was called Go. And the whole story, I just kept using the word go. I looked at you. I saw the light turn from red to green on a silent street, telling me go. I stood outside of your room, not wanting to see you this way, but I knew I had to go. You know, so just kind of the ways to you can find places to use words. Descriptive dialogue, which is when you kind of have to be careful about so that it's authentic. But using patients' actual language and dialects can be really powerful, especially if you know it well, right? Because again, your life lens makes certain things more believable, right? My parents are born and raised in Alabama. So the patients that I take care of at Grady, they are like being at my family reunion. So it's not a stretch for me to describe dialogue in a way that's really natural. You have to be careful about that, but a lot of people can do that too. Um, and I would just say that bringing conversations alive. Sometimes the really simple things like, people rarely say they are coming to school. They'll say they're coming to school. So something as simple as using dialogue and thinking, say it out loud so you can picture somebody saying that. Because if you say, "I'm going upstairs to go get the POCUS machine," you're not going to say, "I am going upstairs." You're going to say, "I'm." So kind of keep those things in mind when you're doing dialogue. Verbal oil painting is something I love to do with students and trainees where we just go outside, sit on a bench for 10 minutes and just look at our environment and watch people walk by. And then we go back inside and write for like 30 minutes. And you try to bring a scene to life with what you saw. Um, a few more styles that I use personally, and as y'all can see, this is Kimberly Manning based. This is not like evidence based, but it's worked for me. One is narrative as if spoken to the subject. I already mentioned that. It's a great way to de-identify people and to allow the reader to create their own imagery. Pushing through pain and imperfections. I cannot say this enough. This is why I love writing about when I mess up or love writing about when something hurt. Um, because everybody has felt pain and everybody has felt like they've fallen short somewhere. And I find that some of the most relatable things that I've written have been places where I did not look good, where I didn't do the right thing. Don't be afraid to do that. You will also usually find a lot of support from your reading community because people are just so happy to see, oh gosh, me too. Looping and threading with metaphors, same thing, like I mentioned before, but maybe finding a metaphor and staying with the metaphor for the whole thing. Time travel is something that I do a lot when I write in the first person of a remote experience because I wasn't, you know, writing a lot when I was in residency. I wish I was. But a lot of those formative experiences are still in the front of my mind. So I think about them a lot. So I'm like, dang, you know what? I remember when I used to be standing in the PICU and my attending used to be like asking me 700 million questions and I had been up for 32 hours. And I just remember wanting to vomit and cry the whole time. You know what? I'm gonna write about that. You know? And then the other thing I do, particularly when I'm having a rough day, um, I'm sure this doesn't happen to you, but sometimes I take care of patients who get on my nerves. Sometimes there are patients who are on my service who I am not looking forward to seeing every day because just for whatever reason, they are not hitting my like button in my soul. What I'll do is I will put myself in their shoes and I will write as them. So I had a patient who was like cussing me out every day. Like every day I came in there and he just found a whole new way to cuss me out. So I sat down and I wrote as if I was him, as if I was waiting for me to come in. And I was like talking about like what I think about this lady and, and who she is and what she always saying to me. And by the end of it, I found I draw a lot of empathy. I do this particularly with patients who are asking me for pain medication, patients who are being sort of contrary or resisting things. It's a great place for you to build empathy and find out, oh, maybe there is a place where I could do better as the healthcare person involved in their care. Some simple things if you want to get published is your grammar should be correct. But if you are writing for another space like Twitter, a blog, lay press, sometimes you can use fragments for emphasis. Part of the reason I write so much over Twitter is that I can write without, so I can follow my own rules. And I don't really like sometimes when people tell me like, oh, I need to make this grammatically correct. And I'm just like, well, The vernacular of my people is not usually grammatically correct by your standards. That just ain't how we talk. So, but there are places for people to get your stories and for you to reach people without it being in a journal. Use your thesaurus, or use metaphors to stop saying the same word over and over. Like if you plummet in the first chapter, you're done plummeting for the rest of the essay. You're gonna have to fall. You're gonna have to, I don't know, find another word. Good writing doesn't usually repeat words or phrases too close together. I think you all know that already. There's a author, Elmore Leonard, the late author, Elmore Leonard. He wrote this great article in the New York Times back in '01 that says, easy on the adverbs, exclamation points, and especially hooptedoodle, which all of y'all have been there. Have you ever read something and you have to keep rereading it because you don't know what the person is saying? That's hooptedoodle. Writing should not feel like writing. You should just be drawn in and feel like you're participating in something that happened. He got that term from John Steinbeck's book, Sweet Thursday, where he said, sometimes I want a book to break loose with a bunch of hooptedoodles, spin up some pretty words, maybe sing a little song with language. That's nice. But I wish it was set aside so I don't have to read it. I don't want hooptedoodle to get mixed up with this story. So watch out for hooptedoodle. That's when you fall so in love with your words that you are forgetting to be a consumer or a reader or a listener to. Kind of going back to what Toni Morrison said. He also said at the end of it, his biggest piece of advice is, if it sounds like writing, rewrite it. So if you write a narrative or an essay, if it sounds like you're trying too hard or like an essay, if somebody, the nicest thing somebody can say to me is, I felt like I was there. So that means that it doesn't sound like writing. It sounds like I'm weaving something to bring you into it with me. Y'all are nerds, so nerds want to get published. So what gets published? Applicable lessons on caring, humanism, and relationships, that gets published. Rants, beware. You telling me how to feel, beware. It's not going to get published. But even if it's something that's uncomfortable, just lay it in front of me and then let me figure out how to feel about it. Reflections on practice experiences and relationships. And relationships can be all sorts of relationships. It can be relationships at home that where you're navigating your job too. It can be your relationship with, your kid's teacher. I've written about stuff with my kids in school, the security officers, the people in the elevator for 20 seconds, all sorts of things. There's lessons that can be found. Just ask yourself, what's the what? And then go from there. Clarity of focus. Don't try to tell too many stories at once. Focus on a what, tell that story with a beginning, a middle, and the end, and you'll be good. Quality writing gets published. And usually if you start in the action, if it's attention grabbing, compelling or attention building, those are things that tend to get published. So don't start with a big, 500 word preamble to get me ready for the story. Just start telling me the story. So on Twitter, I often, the first thing I will do will be dialogue. Actually, it'll be like him. I thought you weren't coming back. That'll be the first thing I'll say. That starts in the action because now I'm with a patient. I don't have to tell you, here's where I am right now, and this is what happened, and I was just about to talk to this patient, and I'm setting the scene. I don't need to set the scene for you. Show, don't tell, right? And the other thing that gets published, the more junior you are, the more likely you are to get published. I swear, there's something about the kids that journals love. If you are a trainee, if you are a medical student, if you know a medical student, if you are an intern, a first year fellow, look, if you are not done with your training, they're gonna publish you because they just love you. Us, they're like, no. And then again, like I said, don't forget to take pictures. Again, I could tell you exactly where I was when I took this picture. I took this picture at Grady one day when one of our patients, his blood pressure was low and we couldn't figure out why was his blood pressure low some days, high some days. And I asked him to bring his pills and he opened up the bottle and this was what was in the bottle. And he was taking one in the morning and one at night of this bottle. He had diabetic retinopathy. He used to have a brother that used to help him out. And his brother had moved and wasn't there to help him anymore. And he was just sort of on his own. And this is what he was doing. Now, I can tell you 500 stories about just this picture alone, like for real. Like we could talk about health disparities. We could talk about what it means to, be a lonely elder. We could talk about diabetic retinopathy and how people like this patient are the ones who get diabetic retinopathy. We can talk about how few retina specialists there are in, resource poor areas. You could just find 100 million things to draw inspiration just from a picture. So don't sleep on taking a picture. Going to give you a couple more examples before I stop and let us just take some questions. This was one where I just looped a metaphor through. I was using a superhero metaphor. And this was a day when I was just feeling tired and I felt like I was getting spread really thin between being a mom and being a teacher. So I say sometimes I wish I was a superhero. Then I describe an interaction with a patient. He gave me the biggest, warmest smile and pulled his shirt apart like Superman. Um, and then this was a patient that I had been talking to try to get to see cardiology to get an aortic valve replaced, and he wouldn't do it. And he had critical aortic stenosis. And I ran into him in a hallway on a particularly shitty day. Sorry to cuss on your recording. But seeing him looking well, I ended it with, no, I am not a bird and I'm not a plane, but I do kind of feel like Superman sometimes. I decide that one of me is enough. So that's just an example of ways that you could do that. And that wasn't for publication anywhere. That was just really for my own reflective practices. You can also make your own metaphors. We're rolling up on the Kentucky Derby season. So this was about a patient who I pronounced dead. And I described like thunderous hooves of horses at the end of a race. I've been doing this long enough to know that it was only a matter of time before she crossed the finish line. And then describing the act of pronouncing a patient dead and then being there with the family after. So the metaphor that I used was still, again, staying on this sort of idea of a horse race. They must have heard those hoofs too, galloping hard, fast, closer and closer. They all wanted to be there to lay the blanket of roses at the very end. Again, imagery that you can create yourself. I provide this here just more for you to note. This was a piece that I wrote after losing my sister to a sudden cardiac death. And my sister died of a sudden cardiac death, November 15th, 2012. 2012, I was not ready to write about it. But by 2013, 14, I was ready to write about it. And I was coming unglued as I was writing it. I mean, I was crying. I was, however, I probably got more letters about this particular piece than any other because a lot of people have had loved ones who have passed from cardiac death. I mean, y'all know that from what you do, right? And the reason why it was so important, what was to me was that every patient is someone's N of one. And here I had spent my whole career learning all these acronyms, not really understanding the true application of it to what it means to have a loved one impacted by heart disease, right? Some final tips for a publication. A good smart title is good. Like I love a witty title. If it's not imperative, take it out. Sometimes I'll have a friend read something of mine and take 200 words out of it for me because I have decided that like I wanted to use the word plummet and I'm like, I can't take that out. And they take plummet out. Fall in love with your lesson. Don't let anybody edit out your lesson. Don't be afraid to push through looking bad or being uncomfortable. It makes your story relatable. If you want to get something published and you're just going to like give a crack at writing something, try to keep it between 1,200 and 1,500 words. Most journals do not want anything over 1,500 words. And it's really painful to cut like 200 or 300 words if you don't have to. Here's some titles I've used, like Death of a Clinician Educator, which was after a colleague left to go to private practice. Unfair Speculations was when I got my first speculum exam at 16, when my doctor asked if I had a boyfriend and did not realize I wasn't sexually active. I Now Pronounce You was about an experience pronouncing a patient dead, and then Fighting for Your Life about being a better patient advocate. So the more you tell stories, what you'll see day to day will change. And the more even that you create mental images or that you take pictures, the more you will be able to kind of see stuff a little bit differently, and how you process things will change as well. And you'll explore your ideas differently. The things that just seem so everyday in the hospital will not seem everyday anymore, right? This was a day when I was just reflecting on how tremendously wonderful it is to have an in-person interpreter for a patient, right? And again, back to James Baldwin, one writes out of one thing and one thing only. one's own experience. And that's going back to you and your life lens and who you are, right? Everything depends on how relentlessly one forces from this experience the last drop, sweet or bitter, it can possibly give.